I'm Jason Fox, the Chief Digital Officer for Consumer Reports, the world's largest and most trusted nonprofit consumer organization. It's an honor to be part of the Town Hall Summit in this extraordinary time, and I'm looking forward to the upcoming Innovation and Entrepreneurship panel. Why? Because there's never been a more important time for entrepreneurs to stand up innovative businesses in areas of need like e-learning, telemedicine, supply chain management, and virus testing, to name just a few. As for existing entrepreneurs, this is a singular moment to double down on innovation or pivot. Customer needs are evolving quickly, so you have to be agile to keep pace even while we shelter in place. We're all in our homes more than ever, and we're casting a critical eye on surroundings we once took for granted. At Consumer Reports, we are seeing strong demand for smaller appliances like freezers and air purifiers, and anything home gym, home office, home entertainment, and home delivery service related. Basically, whatever can be brought to your doorstep or leverages the communications infrastructure. While some of these consumer shifts may be ephemeral, others are likely to be part of our new normal and inform your business strategy going forward. As you survey the consumer landscape, look for jobs to be done. That phrase, coined by the late Clay Christensen, posits that when we buy a product or service, we essentially hire it to help us do a job. If it does the job well, we tend to hire that product or service again. And if it does a crappy job, we fire it and look for new solutions. Put another way, the best products and services are meaningfully different, better than their competition. Finally, remember that ideas are cheap. Be that entrepreneur or innovator who turns ideas into reality. Now, I hope you'll join me in watching the panel, which includes my friend and former colleague, Sneha Shah from Refinitiv. Back to you, India.
Thank you, Jason. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. Before I start speaking and introduce myself, I'm India Gary Martin. I'd like to introduce my panel, some really great minds from around the world who have global experience, and I think we'll really be able to talk to innovation and entrepreneurship in a way that will be very thought-provoking, and hopefully you go away with some strategies out of the back of this. But let me just start by introducing first Dr. Maeve Houston. Welcome, Dr. Maeve. Maeve is the head of UX research at Disney Streaming Services, so lots of interesting insight there. A background in UX research for quite a long time, both at Capital One and Amazon Audible. Welcome, Maeve. Nice to have you. Then we have Colin Isles. Thank you. And then we have Colin Isles, who you'll see there with the wonderful green screen. Welcome, Colin. Nice to see you. Colin has held a number of amazing roles over the course of his career, lots in the innovation space particularly, but is now the founder of Innovation Catalysts based in Johannesburg, South Africa. Welcome, Colin. And then we have Grace Mellis. Grace is hailing from the wonderful sunny state of California. Hi, Grace. Grace is the chair of HireCar, a NASDAQ-listed company, and advisor for Techstars Tech Incubator. And I have a really interesting story about that, which we'll talk about later. And Grace is based in Pasadena, as I mentioned. Welcome, Grace. And then we have Sneha Shah, last but not least. So Sneha is the managing director of Refinitiv's Business Accelerator. And previously the managing director for Africa for Reuters, Thomson Reuters. Welcome, Sneha. So, you know, this panel, when I was thinking about and having conversations with the team around what innovation and entrepreneurship means in the current crisis, this group of people immediately came to mind for a variety of different reasons, which will be evidenced as we go through the course of this conversation. I'm really lucky to have you all and really appreciate you showing up. Particularly as you all are quite busy innovating and doing the things that you do and running businesses that require your brain trust at all moments in time. But I'm going to kind of talk about the shape of this a little bit. And you know, crisis often drives innovation in ways that can't happen quickly in other circumstances, and thus entrepreneurship. And so we'll talk about the current environment for entrepreneurs, both established and aspiring, and the gaps that are emerging that weren't immediately as visible pre-crisis. There was a really interesting quote that I'm going to read to you. This is an excerpt from the Harvard Business Review. But there was a gentleman who was talking about his business and how it was impacted. He was from a bigger company. And then all these kind of smaller new entrants came in. And I think we're going to see a lot of that happen in the current environment. Folks who are really agile and have the capability of jumping into spaces where there are gaps without the baggage of having huge corporate kind of behemoth, I don't know the word I'm looking for, but who don't have to kind of drag corporations along, so they can kind of jump in. And he says, we're seeing focused competitors in nearly every segment of our business. They're small, but they attack like piranhas. The new entrants bring out products and services that their distributors loved. Their lenient return policies, and these are the actual small companies that were in their sector, encourage customers to try their offerings. Their faster deliveries within tight time frames reduce distributors' warehousing costs and inventory levels. And they essentially kind of killed the business that this person was in. And so I want to kind of talk about the fact that obviously new entrants can be more agile and come to market more quickly with new products and respond to emerging trends, but they can lack the operational know-how to build sustainable frameworks for long term. So as we kind of go through this process, I also kind of want to touch on that with each of you who kind of are seeing some of that, but also experiencing what it is to have to innovate very quickly in your respective spaces. So I'm going to start with Grace Mellon. Grace, you started your career in big corporates, and your last big role being, you actually were at Green Dot as CFO, but also CFO of Investor Services at JP Morgan for Europe. But since then, you've been an investor and advisor for a number of tech and consumer startups. Given your proximity to the startup world, what are you seeing with regards to trends around innovation in the current crisis? And I think if you could talk about whether in that smaller startups are seeing kind of like evaporating capital, or whether people are putting their money with new and exciting developments, that would be great. So can we start there? I don't know if we have a frozen Grace. It looks like we might. So whilst we're dealing with that technical difficulty, Maeve, I'm going to hop to you. I'll come back to. I'll reframe that question for Grace as she becomes available. But Maeve, you work in the UX space, kind of user space, user experience space. For those who aren't familiar with the term, and I think it's really important that folks in this kind of environment are really intentional about customer engagements and experience during the crisis, because people remember how you made them feel, whether it's positive or negative, as we kind of move through this. So wearing your UX hat, what consumer trends are emerging in this crisis, and how might businesses respond in a way that captures the longer term value and loyalty of customers who are seeking, frankly, at the base, comfort and stability?
Well, thank you for that question. It's a great question. This pandemic has really changed the way that people relate to one another. For example, a DJ on Instagram Live had an event in early March, and over 200,000 people showed up. After that, this spawned multiple DJs doing the same thing and recording artists producing digital concerts. Families are staying connected using video technology that used to be the domain of road warriors and corporations. But now families are using this to stay connected and bond with one another. The former is an example of tapping into the unmet needs of hundreds of thousands of people, and the former is people tapping into a resource that met an emergent need. And by need, I really mean job to be done. They're hiring people to do these for them. But the reality is, human needs really haven't changed all that much. We all crave connection and community and comfort and stability. And what has changed really are our circumstances. We're all sheltering in place now. And so we're being forced to find new and innovative ways of meeting that that need of connection and comfort and stability with other means other than just walking up to your family and giving them a hug. We have to find new ways to do that. So businesses that seek to understand these emotional needs, these jobs to be done during this time and the context of behavior and the environments that people are in, and then ideate innovative ways to meet those emotional needs, will be super ahead of the curve in the long run. And so, long after we emerge from this pandemic, the companies who keep their focus in a human centered way, when they keep their focus on designing thoughtful products based on the thoughts, feelings, and behaviors and the jobs to be done of consumers, well, those companies will be ahead in the long run and people will remain loyal to them.
That's awesome. And it's a really it's a useful it's just useful to be able to frame that, because I think that, one of the really interesting things around what business is being forced to do is be much more focused on the customer's experience and actually what people want in a different way. I think that,
Mhm.
always we develop products based upon what we think people want. But it feels to me to be much more challenging to design for comfort and safety. I mean, those are kind of such intangibles and they mean
Mhm.
such different things to different people, that being able to kind of, as a business, develop for that in addition to whatever the kind of technical need is, seems to
Mhm.
be like where the rubber hits the road. And I think one of the more challenging things that we'll experience. Are you seeing that? Are you finding that alignment challenging to get when you're thinking about how you do your own work?
Well, for me, when we're doing this kind of work, we really are focused on uncovering jobs to be done, and those are really defined as these emotional and functional needs that people have. And so you uncover them in pretty much the same way. It's having an empathetic conversation with them to kind of understand those needs. And so for us, it's basically us doing what we've always done, which is have these conversations, and probably have a lot more than we did in the past. But uncovering those emotional and functional needs. Emotional needs are super important because something might fit your functional need, but if it doesn't fit your emotional need, often people will kind of abandon it, because they know something's missing until something else comes along that really fits that emotional need, but maybe isn't as functionally good, but they don't care. They'll stick with that because there's something really sticky about something that hits that emotional spot.
Awesome. Perfect. Grace, do we have you?
Yes, I think I'm finally back.
Yay, we're glad to see you. So I'll go back and re-ask your question and just kind of prime you for it. So you started your career in big corporates. One of your big roles, one of your former roles being as the CFO of Investor Services at JP Morgan in Europe. I'm also CFO at Green Dot Corporation. But since then, you've been an investor and an advisor for a number of tech companies and startups. And so, kind of given your proximity to the startup world, what are you seeing with regards to trends around innovation in the current crisis? And are you seeing businesses paralyzed by evaporating capital, or is there capital out there for the kind of new and exciting developments that are starting to occur?
Well, I mean, it's a very pertinent question, and I was actually on a couple CEO calls yesterday just discussing fundraising. I think that with TechStars, luckily they had a TechStars Anywhere program already, where they had been experimenting for years with founders who couldn't make it to a local incubator. So they set up methodology for people to actually be remote and work from Kentucky, Denver, San Diego, wherever they are, and still be in a program. I'm lucky enough to sort of mentor several different programs. So I was on the Anywhere program at the same time I was doing Techstars Music, which actually requires it's an international program that brings everybody into LA from all around the world. So we had people in from Australia, from Estonia, UK, and when COVID hit, the two programs, very different reactions, right? We had to send everyone home. And with that, it was very difficult because we then had to pivot that program, which where the labels are our LPs, where Warner, where Sony, where Rekotoku from Japan, where they come and they actually all gather in a theater and wait for demo days, to be presented and then interact with the actual companies, right? So we've got these hardware, software companies, these ticketing companies, people who are at the intersection of tech and music, and all of a sudden they're being sent back around the world where they've been recruited for the past 6 months, and they've got to do this remotely. I think we were very lucky because of the Anywhere program. We were able to pivot quite quickly and move people online. But I also saw the difference in terms of how the cohorts performed. The Anywhere program, it didn't make a difference. All of their mentoring and all of the stuff was online. They only had one in-person meeting in the beginning to kick off, and then another in the middle, and they missed out on their trip to New York. But from a mentorship program, they're used to seeing us on a Zoom call. I think for the music program, it's very difficult. I mean, it's you're pitching to artist management companies, you're pitching to people you don't know, and you don't have that personal connection. So that's part of where people had to pivot very quickly, and where programs that were already set up to do this did better, and actually scaled better. Crazily enough, we had one company that was trying to help farmers get food to table, and they were in Portland, and their projections blew out of the water because all of a sudden farmers no longer had their restaurateurs. They didn't have the distribution channels they had before, and they needed a new way to get their goods out to market. So there's a huge shift in which companies did well and which companies didn't do well as a result of COVID and us being sheltering in place. I think the capital issue is also a big one. I think on March 17th, the world saw the U.S. capital markets just drop out in a single biggest fall since the 1930s, and there was a paralysis at some point. I think the traders made money, but angel investors, seed capital, venture capital companies were going to then help the companies they'd already invested in. So there wasn't a huge amount of excess capital for the new companies that were going out to raise. So if a class had finished last fall and they said, I'm going to go raise in March, all of their things that they had planned evaporated, right? And it's been very difficult for some of those companies to raise. One of the companies, Fine Sisterhood, is a social app for women, by women. And we had, the CEO of Hello Sunshine had organized something here for everybody to come together for a fundraise, and it was for March 25th. You can imagine what happened to that, right? All these assembled people over months and months of work just disappeared. But the launch still happened, and CEOs are still going on, and they're trying to conserve capital. And I think in the previous panelists, they talked about risk mitigation, right? And that's really what we're talking about with a lot of the companies I work with now, which is, okay, so if you just finish your program and there is capital available and people actually still want to invest in your company, do you take it now or hope for a bigger round later? And if I look at where the stock market is now, I think Stanley Druckenmiller just said yesterday, it's too high, right? There's an over exuberance. I think there's a lot of hope in America, but everything's overvalued by a significant percentage. And I was on a HBS call, and with the dean of Harvard Business School, who basically just said, we're not sure how we're going to start school. 30% of our class is international. We may have to start everybody online, and for those who feel safe, migrate them slowly onto campus or not, or let people defer. And the other prediction is that the S&P will probably drop by another 10 to 15% in September through October, when the reality of our recovery becomes more, I think, clear. And so right now the market's recovered, so there may be capital. The angels might be feeling a little better about what they have. The PPP is out, and so some of those companies are turning back to actually giving credit lines that were shut down a few months ago. But I think that if you don't take the capital now and you're in the middle of a raise, and you have companies that are willing to invest in you, you might be looking down a long barrel in come fall, because if you thought you were going to raise then, I think the world's going to look very different in 3 to 6 months.
Perfect. Thank you. That's a tremendous kind of view of the world, because I think that's something we're experiencing all around. And, I think the capital question, I think it's really interesting, because out of this crisis will come such opportunity. And there will be such an opportunity for folks to kind of dip into spaces, but not necessarily access to the capital to make it happen, right? So the question is, if we had unlimited capital, there could be some amazing innovation, and there still will. And I think maybe to some extent, the cream will float to the top, and folks will fund the things that are absolutely, kind of no brainers. But it's a real challenge around kind of identifying some of those things first, and then second, for the folks who have these wonderful ideas and and access to really great thought leadership around the how, but not necessarily cash to do the what, right? So that's going to be, I think, an interesting space. So Sneh, I'll come on to you, um, actually, because I'd like to talk a little bit about types of businesses. And one of the things that's been kind of an enduring thread through your whole career, and as long as I've known you, is purpose. I mean, you've talked about that, and how important it is for businesses, the intersection of kind of people, technology and purpose, as being the crux of how businesses really should operate. But in addition to your corporate career, you've done that and had, you've been part of the World Economic Forum, United Nations, Harambe, just kind of focusing on demonstrating that purposeful business is not only good for staff and clients, but can also be tremendous drivers of revenue and economic growth. You're now running a new, I think, as of kind of a few months ago, business accelerator at Refinitiv. I think just kind of given how quickly this crisis emerged post your launch, this accelerator, what are some of the challenges that you're seeing, and what opportunities do you see, given what we've been talking about around comfort, stability, purpose, um, around entrepreneurship in the current environment, and what do you look for? Because I think one of the things that's coming out of that I'd like to come out of this panel is people to figure out how they identify the needs, like how they might start thinking about the identification of those things.
Yeah, so I think, one of the most interesting things about innovation is about solving problems, and generally solving problems under constraints. So even the capital is just a constraint. It's not, it's not an unsolvable problem. But I actually think there's no better time than now to actually think about innovating and being an entrepreneur, because the amount of problems that we have in the world with our new normal are tremendous, and they're all problems that have not been solved before. And so if you're someone with ideas and with the ability to actually bring those ideas to market, this is the time, right? Because if you think about, it's everything from the obvious healthcare testing issues to actually what is our new world going to look like. And we're not going to go back to normal. And I think, I keep hearing people say we're going to go back, and we're not going back anywhere. We're going to go forward, right? Because from where we are, there is no going back. And so the best thing we could do is actually imagine what that forward is like, and then actually design it. And so I think that's the opportunity for entrepreneurs. And that's where sort of purpose-driven business is really going to play a big trend, because the best, most agile, innovative businesses will be those that solve real problems in our new future. And that's everything from very practical issues like, we're all on Teams now and on Zoom and on all these conference calls, and we've got this overwhelming amount of data. And we're in the data business. And one of the things is today in the world, we're generating 40 zettabytes of data, which doesn't sound a lot, but actually 40 zettabytes is 40 trillion gigabytes of data is generated this year. And we're growing that to sort of 2025 is going to be 125 zettabytes. And so the number of sort of data points that we're all having to take in, the Zoom fatigue, the sort of, I guess it's the multitasking, all of that is taking a huge toll on human beings. And actually the technology has got an opportunity at this point to solve that by really being smarter. And so we work with a company in the accelerator. We've partnered with a company called Module Q. And Module Q, for example, brings in AI-driven insights into Microsoft Teams. So instead of you having to go search for information, it learns about what's important to you and then surfaces data and information just when you need it in your workflow. So it just takes away a huge amount of noise in the system. So that's a very practical example of things that, are really in the workplace. But of course, there's like lives at stake here. And Claire Christensen, who Jason talked about, he wrote this book, The Prosperity Paradox, with the Harambeans, around how innovation can really solve for big problems in the world. And we're seeing that, with everything from sort of carbon and sort of the carbon footprint, and now companies all rethinking how are they actually going to go forward into this new normal. And actually, maybe they don't need those business trips, and maybe they don't need those offsites, and how do they reform their business in a way that's a lot more environmentally friendly, to immediate things like there's a Harambean that I mentor in South Africa, an entrepreneur, and his company is called Lula. And Lula had started up as a rideshare company before this crisis, and they've pivoted their entire business model to essential worker transport safely in South Africa, which is a massive opportunity, for his business, but also a tremendous need in the market. Zipline, which is an incredible service in Africa that's been doing drone delivery in Rwanda, has pivoted their business into medical supply drone delivery. So that through this crisis, you can imagine in Africa, distribution is a massive issue, right? So it's not just actually finding people, testing them, but actually delivering them medical supplies. And so Zipline's doing that. And I think those are the types of opportunities that I really see. Is there are so many problems. And so if you're an entrepreneur, this is the time to really step up and think about how do you solve those problems and how do you step into that new normal and design the future.
Yes, I mean that's brilliant. There are so many pearls there that we could pull out. I mean, I think the interesting thing that you said there that struck me as you were kind of talking through it is it's not just about entering the market space. It's also about if you're in it already, how you pivot and how you remain, how you kind of stay relevant through this period of rapid change. And then that for me seems a real challenging piece, right? Because it was so funny. I think maybe like sometime in March, I was thinking to myself, and I think I even might have tweeted it or written about it, that boy, Uber and Co better change their business models really quickly because we're not going to be hopping. I'm not going to be getting in the back of an Uber for some time. Being completely frank, what might they do? They should move to delivery because if you look at the kind of exponential amount of delivery, Amazon has made a gazillion, bazillion more dollars than they already had because suddenly people are ordering everything online. There's a reticence to go out into public, a whole bunch of things which are driving some of that. So I really appreciate that. And I think, we'll carry on this conversation after I have a conversation with Colin, but I'd really like for us to come back and talk about that kind of pivot and how people might do it. I know that Grace, for you, there's one of the Techstar companies actually distributed a product which you sent to me. We were talking about it, and what they've essentially done is they're taking subscriptions now for September. And I was like, I want this, and I did it. And so there are people who are really smartly, getting access to capital in ways that are non-traditional in the first instance. I mean, that's a model that exists, but during this crisis, it's a brilliant kind of pivot in ensuring that you can continue to do product development whilst you're in the midst of a crisis. So, Colin, I'm gonna come to you. Colin, I met in South Africa actually when he was the CEO of Equinox Innovation and Leadership Center, and I'm going to tell you that that I still think about my conversations with Colin and watching him present. I mean, he comes foremost in my mind around innovation, particularly in so many ways. But Colin, you're quoted as saying that most organizations develop and execute strategies that are no longer appropriate to deal with the existential threats that disruptive technologies bring. Does that also apply to strategies to deal with threats beyond disruptive technologies and new entrants and I'm considering the COVID-19 crisis a new entrant in this conversation. What would good planning look like, and how might organizations arbitrage the potential outcomes from this crisis and turn them into frameworks for kind of C-level change, given your work in kind of leadership, purpose, entrepreneurship, innovation, all of those things, the spaces that you work in?
Yeah, thanks, India. It's a great question. To frame it, let's start with that initial statement. Most businesses, we just go back to November last year. Most businesses are well behind the curve. Technology is just advancing at such a rapid exponential rate. A lot of the things that are happening now were forecastable. They were just expected to happen over perhaps a longer duration. So if you think about a range of technologies, I love the way that it's framed by Sally Mishma when he says it's not just living one Gutenberg moment, we're living multiple Gutenberg moments at the same time. So that was obviously the printing press and starting to go and share information globally. We've got multiple Gutenberg moments. It's not just AI, obviously it's all the forms of AI. We've got VR that's coming along. We've got massive changes in the cost capacity ratios of battery technology, which is obviously fantastic, from everything from the phones that we use all the way to the cars, and potentially over time in aircraft. We've got photovoltaic just coming down exponentially in price, which is allowing distributed systems to go and access tech energy. And many people think that energy costs carrying on at this current rate are essentially going to become, free at some point. Similar ideas with 5G and internet access, where you can see the cost of access. And the internet is such an important backbone. It's like water now. It's like air. I mean, it really should be a human right, because with that, with cloud technology, with massive compute power, which is coming down, it just opens up so many opportunities for anyone in the world to go and innovate, to solve problems, as Sneha put it. And it doesn't matter. They can be sitting in New York, they can be sitting in London, they can be literally in Timbuktu, they can be anywhere in the world. And as long as they've got access through computers now to massive compute, whether it's Amazon Web Services, you can do absolutely incredible things. That tsunami, that massive set of Gutenberg moments is, I think, something that most incumbent organizations and their leadership teams have consistently been unable to stretch their imagination enough to think about both the opportunities that it brings and, more importantly, the threats. And so it's no wonder that when you look back over, let's say the last decade or so, you can ask the question, why didn't the Marriott team come up with the idea that was then instigated by Airbnb? Why did Kodak first go into digital? And you're just seeing an acceleration of that now, because these things were going to occur anyway. And now COVID-19, with the lockdown that's occurred, is starting to go and put pressure on, let's just use some examples, schools, online education, Khan Academy, Udemy, Coursera is just one example. There's been a huge opportunity for people to start educating online for years now. This could be that behavioral change moment where it's forced upon us, where who wants to go back to bricks and mortar education? Who wants to get on a long haul flight when it's perfectly adequate to go and do a Zoom call? Who wants to be going into a shop when you can use artificial intelligence with VR and augmented reality solutions over the coming years, and you can avoid having to go and queue and spend that horrid time in a kind of a sales process in a shop, in a shopping center with parking. So the way I look upon it is, it's going to be difficult to draw it, but most organizations, I think, look in the present too much. They almost imagine this normal distribution of risk which they manage, and they kind of get away with a little bit of scenario analysis based on their competitors and thinking a year or two ahead based on their historical data from the previous 5 years. Few organizations are sitting there and saying the world is changing. We've got to go and set a really clear innovation strategy in our organization to make sure we radically try to go and disrupt ourselves, because if we don't, at the end of the day, someone else will be. This opportunity now, although COVID-19 is terrible, it should be an opportunity for leaders to go and use this to reinvent themselves, to re-explore what the future could be like. It's a trial run which has been squeezed into weeks as opposed to a number of years. And it gives the opportunity to really imagine what it's going to be like. What are you going to do when autonomous cars come in? Well, that's meant to be 4 or 5 years away, potentially. Maybe it's going to become that bit quicker. It's time to go and change your business model to either support that innovation or to go and find new businesses which won't be disrupted when that innovation comes in. From a government perspective, let's bring them in. How are they going to go and deal with mass redundancies because of automation? Will there be a universal basic income? We can explore the possibilities now, and we're having to explore it in some countries by actually starting those types of experiments. So for me, this, and I think Sarah said it as well, is a massive opportunity for leaders to really get that wake-up call and to think radically differently about how they should be investing in what previously were these kind of small probability tail risks, these black swan events, if you follow Nassim Taleb, and actually have that realization they're far more frequent, they're happening all the time, and organizations are going to have to better prepare for a multitude of these black swan events, because there's more coming. This is not the first or the last.
This is certainly isn't the first or the last. I was in the previous plenary session, which was leading in the new normal. We were talking about the number of crises that we've each been through, and I was talking about the fact that I went through 9/11. I lived in Asia during 2003 during the SARS crisis. I then worked at Lehman Brothers in 2008, and then and now I'm dealing with this again. So like every kind of the bigger kind of economic events anyway, I've experienced in some shape or form. And I think the thing that struck me, Colin, and I'll ask Maeve this question actually, but the thing that struck me, Colin, that you said, or the theme that emerged as you were kind of speaking for me is like, gosh, how do you connect to consumers remotely? Like, because you're talking about, folks, actually using technology, VR and AI and a whole bunch of other things in terms of how we're moving in terms of our doing shopping and everything else. Like, how do you connect consumers in such a crowded space? Because suddenly the internet provides this huge place where folks who may not have had access before are suddenly, in the space. And so, maybe you can talk a little bit about that, about how you connect consumers in a really crowded market space when suddenly, that's going to be the way. And we're so accustomed, and I think that Colin spoke it so well. We're so accustomed to kind of doing things the way we always have and trying to apply the kind of old frameworks and models that we don't think about the opportunity that exists. So can you talk a little bit about that? And I want to say before I hand over to you that Q&A will start in about 10 minutes or so people can start popping their questions in the Q&A box. Please don't use the chat. Our executive producer is using our Q&A box. But Maeve, what are your thoughts about how we might connect to consumers remotely and how we crack that nut?
So for most, I think researchers in most of the companies that I talk to, we're using some of the same tools that we've been using for years, and those are tools that help us recruit and find people to talk to. And so we use Zoom. So often we don't travel to, say, certain parts of the country to do research studies. We'll just do those with Zoom. And we've been doing that for a long time in every role that I've had since 2005, I would say. We've been doing that kind of work. So that part isn't as different being in a technology space. I think what's harder is finding the right groups of people. So something else that Colin mentioned was that a lot of the ways that people need to think about innovating in the future is to kind of look on the long tail. And for us, in kind of innovating with a design thinking strategy, we call that looking to the edges, because we say that's where the breakthroughs are. And so it's finding those people that's a little bit more difficult, not necessarily in the sense that we just can't find those people, but even identifying what those edge populations are, so that we can make sure we have coverage when we talk to people in a study. That's really important. And so that's why we typically use an army of vendors, and also recruiting tools, online recruiting tools that we have at our disposal to help us find those people.
Awesome. Awesome. And Grace, I think, can you just give a quick overview of what Techstars is and how it works? Because I think that will be really useful in the context of folks kind of thinking about opportunities and just some of the things that you might have seen, particularly around incubation at this stage of the game.
Well, there are a lot of incubators out there and a lot of accelerators that people can choose from. Techstars is one of the only global ones. So they have programs in South Africa and the UK, in the Middle East, in LA. And so they're probably the only one that's got a global reach with MDs and programs and events over the past decade in every continent, just about, and with MDs that are local as well as those that do remote investing. So here in LA, there are two programs, Techstars LA and Techstars Music, for instance. They bring in a class of 10 to 15 startups every year, and there's a recruitment process. And then once the companies come in, they take a percentage of the company for the initial investment of about 150K, and then they help them with the surround of mentorship. The reach of mentors is in the thousands. Each class typically has locally a reach of in the hundreds, 80 to 100 mentors at their availability, and you go through the process and you mentor match. And so it's a very resilient and deep process, and it's also goes on forever. So they actually have founder conventions every year that bring people back together. This year was in Italy, previously in Oakland. And so they always joke Techstars is for life. And the theme and the motto of Techstars is give first. From a mentorship perspective, from a founder perspective, that once you're a founder, you've come through, you give first to the people coming along. As a mentor, you give first. Yes, we have the opportunity to invest in, but those companies monetarily, but we actually invest ourselves in those companies first. And you mentioned, both Audigo, which is a company that just went through Techstars Music, they looked at an opportunity. We've got these cell phones now that have amazing video, but sound is terrible. And this guy he was at Tesla for 7 years as an engineer doing systems for the cars, but he was a musician. And so he's like, how are these sound systems so terrible? And so he's actually done a 3D printed tiny mic that can actually do amazing audio quality sound without having to go into a sound studio. And so he's created the software behind to do the levers and to change the sound and then to sync that back to your video. So he's already demoed this with musicians where they're playing, and then the quality of having that studio sound matched up. And all of a sudden he has an opportunity, right, of distribution because people are home. There's more YouTubers, TikTok, whatever it is. But you need to have capital to actually go and manufacture, and you also have to have the manufacturing line and ability to ship. And so one of the other startups is doing organic chili made out of in China, and she's like, my stuff's stuck. I can't actually get my stock because it's actually been produced, but nothing's being shipped, or the docks aren't open. So there's a spoilage question if it's a food item. There's a timing question if it's a hardware item. We have to think of supply chains in a very different way. And you mentioned Uber. One of my other startups is Hire Car, where I chair, and they had to do that pivot because they provide cars for people without cars to drive for Uber and Lyft. And with COVID, all of a sudden we had to pivot to delivery, just as India had mentioned earlier. And we pivoted from almost 90% of our drivers driving for Uber and Lyft to a huge percentage of them now driving for delivery. But the great thing about delivery is they're making actually more money than they were driving for Uber and Lyft, because with tips and people being grateful and them being on the front lines, they're actually able to get out there and actually make more trips and more money. So we're partnering with the city of LA to get people who are out of work, or MLB, we're talking to the Dodgers about people who are being furloughed, the people who were selling for concession, the people who were cleaning, all those people are out of work. How do we help them figure out how to onboard into the gig economy and do something different until they can get back into those sports arenas and have, their day job back? This is a huge opportunity for a lot of companies to take what they're doing, pivot, and then find new opportunities to grow. But it really will sort the wheat from the chaff, because the stuff that's the chaff just won't get invested in.
Absolutely. That is very true. I think, Sneha, coming to you, speaking of that, I think it's really interesting to kind of consider. So we've talked about the pivot quite a lot, but when you think about new entrants, particularly as you're kind of running an accelerator, what are some of the kinds of things? So, obviously we can't give people the kind of blueprint for these are the needs that you can meet. These are the spaces, because obviously it's evolving so quickly, that everything is not going to stick, but some things will. But when you think about the kinds of businesses that you look for, or that you're going to be looking for, going forward, because you're kind of pushing full-fledged ahead regardless of what's happening around, what are some of the criteria that you look for? Because I think for people who are thinking about how they evolve and grow businesses and how they even start businesses, kind of having an understanding of the kind of criteria that accelerators look for when they're thinking about evaluating viable options that they might, and I know part of it is sector driven for you, but still that it would be useful if you could talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, for us, because we're in the sort of data business, we're really looking for people who've got data. And I think one of the really interesting things is we used to talk about financial services data as being quite fundamental data, right? Stock prices and currencies and things that you could imagine being in the financial world. But now with this crisis, what's really interesting is alternative data has become really a big part of people's financial models. So if you think about supply chain, and Grace talked about how supply chain has become so different, how do you actually start to see where problems might be in your supply chain using alternative data? And one of the recent examples that I'm really interested in, that I'm looking at, is this company called Kinsa. And Kinsa has got smart thermometers, and they built them so that they could actually track where there might be unexplained fevers and during flu season in the United States. And they've been collecting this data for a number of years now. And so they were able to predict the New York spike in fevers as being indicative that actually there was an outbreak happening in New York. And if you look now, almost 18 days to the day, they mirror the death rate in New York. And so, by sort of being able to see that ahead of time, you could actually start thinking about, what are the risks that you've got if you've got headquarters there, if you've got people going there, if you've got all of those things. How do you actually proactively prepare for that so that you're not contributing to the problem? And then how do you de-risk your business accordingly? So I think the alt data and sort of the different types of data models coming into traditional finance models is a massive trend. And I think also this idea of responsible business, where it's not just, before we used to talk about responsible business being you make a lot of money and then you give it back through your CSR arm. Actually, it's now about, are you a trusted business? Are you someone that people want to do business with, right? How you handle whether you applied for one of those small business loans or not, and whether you're entitled to it, how you handle your employees and whether you're furloughing people or not, and what you're doing around it, how you handle your environmental footprint going forward, how you handle your customers and obligations that people have. All of those things are now going to make you either a responsible business or not. And so I think if you're an entrepreneur in the area of figuring out how to use data to drive more responsible business, whether it's things like ethics indexes or indices or employee engagement data, or how do people feel about going back to work, or what might be the new normal in terms of benefits for people, sort of how people can feel like they're part of a community in this new normal, in a new workplace, or how can leaders connect with their employees in this new normal. I think those are all going to be very interesting spaces to explore in data. But I think everything in our world now is data driven. So I think it is very much, I think as Colin, as Grace said, like find where the issue is and then find a way to kind of pivot what you already know about, what you're passionate about, towards that.
That's, I mean, that is so clear and in so many ways and so plain spoken, because it's really hard to navigate this stuff. And it really is, because it's such a big space when you think about what entrepreneurship looks like and the opportunities it presents, and what innovation looks like and the opportunity that it presents in this kind of environment. So Colin, I'm going to come to you on 2 points, 2 questions, slightly different, but they could be related. And I'm going to kind of start to tie in questions from Q&A. So if I'm looking off slightly to the side, it's because I have a big monitor here, which our producer is popping questions to me on. We'll probably have time for 2 or 3. We're at 12:15, and apologies, we were a little bit late. We were changing over from the previous panel, so apologies for that. But we have a couple of questions I'd like to kind of shoot over, and I'd start with you, Colin. One of them is about, you talked about internet bandwidth. I mean, the internet and how important it is and how it should be a human right. This question is about bandwidth and like the I'm talking physical bandwidth of the internet, and how and what happens if we were to lose that, or how it might be shored up, because that with all of the folks who are online now, especially with lots of organizations shifting to work from home and a whole bunch of other things, what does that mean? And do you have any experience, or what are your thoughts around what that could mean, the challenges that might present?
And the second question, or?
Yeah, sure. The second question, which was also a great one, came from Michelle Bishop at Harlem Needle Arts in New York. And she asks about any suggestions around how we get senior populations involved in the kind of technology spaces, particularly. She talks about being extremely concerned about reaching those who are refusing to get connected in some way. And actually, it's going to become more critical as this evolves, especially as we move to more remote everything. And so she asked that question, which I think is also a really interesting one.
Sure, yeah. I mean, the first one is something I think for the technologists in that space. All I can say on that is I've been surprised how stable and sturdy that the access to the internet and access to data centers has been, from my experience. I mean, we had a major transatlantic pipe that went down here from South Africa. And yeah, you could feel it a little bit. You did notice that speeds were dropping and some of the stability was lost, but 3 or 4 weeks later, it's been fixed. So I've been incredibly impressed about how resilient it seems to have been so far. And I would suspect that a crisis like this is just going to give renewed interest for people that do play in that space to invest even more billions to make sure that the internet and all of the infrastructure that goes with it is just going to continue expanding over the next coming years. It was a real shame. I saw that OneWeb has had to sort of pull out of the market because they ran out of funds. They obviously couldn't get SoftBank. I mean, if you've not heard of them, they were looking at really putting a satellite array out there so that we'd be able to access the internet from initially areas outside of towns, places where it's a bit harder to go and lay cables down. But they were just one company. I mean, that's something, for example, which Elon Musk has been doing through SpaceX. It's something where there's rumors that Amazon are going to buy out their assets and continue it. And I think more are going to go into that. So whether it be 5G, cable companies, people that are in the satellite industry, expect more and more people to be participating in that space, because obviously this is a really good heads up that you can see demand for data is just going to continue going through the roof. As Snar said, we're at zettabytes. Well, we're on an exponential curve there again. I don't know what comes after zettabytes, but expect us to be hitting that, in the coming years, especially when you see the more data intensive requirements coming on, whether it's, 5G autonomous cars or virtual reality becomes something which we're using more regularly in various aspects of our life, from meetings to brainstorms to schools and so on and so on. So I certainly hope I'm right. And I hope there's no engineers out there that state that this is actually never going to be the case, because it's going to be a really big problem if we do run out of capacity, or if capacity goes down from time to time. We're so dependent on it for basically the world to work. In terms of the senior population, again, I think it's a really interesting one. I think if we talk to the senior population and put it in those terms, they'd be very cross with us. But it's certainly the case that we've got this expectation that the more senior, the more elderly you are, the harder it is to adapt. It's not actually my experience. I think that we go into a lot of these conversations and just throw things at people and expect them to use it. I've been working on technology and just using the laptops. Actually, I'm going to use a better example. I use my son. He's 8. He's been playing on Fortnite for a year or so. I probably shouldn't say that. I don't know if that's a good thing or not. But regardless, his ability, his speed, his ability to go and interact in that community in a way which I can't understand because I think I've touched it once or twice. It's a good analogy in terms of then going to someone who's elderly, who hasn't used Zoom before, who hasn't used an online course on Udacity before. It's foreign. And like anything, if you want people to adopt, you've got to go and show them in a way which they understand the benefits which are there for them, if they can be willing and able to take the time to go and learn how to use the platform. In the same way that if I want to go and compete with my children, I'm going to have to put some time and effort to go and understand the keystrokes and the actions, and in fact what the whole game is about, to go and understand that Fortnite arena. And so they're not going to adopt immediately overnight, because no one does, not even people of our age or even the young guys that are coming through. You're going to have to be getting interested and excited about it. And if you can get passionate about it, I don't think age has any difference at all about the speed that people can actually adapt to these new technologies.
Agreed. I mean, I think in a lot of ways, I will say my 73-year-old mother is on Instagram. So that's a whole nother, I mean, it's amazing to me, but that's another story that we'll save for another, maybe after this, we'll talk about that one a little bit. I know that we're running tight on time, and it's been such a tremendous conversation. And I've learned a lot when I think about the various themes that have emerged. And I hope that our viewers have as well. But I will ask you each one question. I'll ask you to keep it short and concrete. But my question is, from this crisis, what would be your innovation dream? What would you love to see emerge on the other side of this? Because it will end at some point. We don't know what that length is. But if you, with your innovator caps on, something emerged out of this, what would it be? I'll start with Grace.
Oh goodness, that's a tough question. There's so many amazing innovations happening right now. I think that my innovation dream is that with all this connectedness and all of the ability to do this virtually, VR headsets and Oculus Rift, Disney streaming, going live and blowing it out of the water. I think that we still remember to actually invest in the technologies that bring us together physically too, after this is all over. That we don't forget that human element, however we do it.
Awesome.
But that's my innovation dream.
Excellent. Maeve?
So a lot of people may not know this, but in my spare time, I like to teach design thinking to young people. And I call it trying to embed a little bit of innovation thinking into the people who are our future. And so my innovation dream actually is to put innovation tools in the hands of way more young people and kids because they're so creative, and the way that they look at problems is often so different than how we might look at it. We might have like whole planning discussions about a problem before we jump in and do something, and young kids are known to just leap in and start making something to try to solve. But I think them those tools and recognizing that anybody and everybody can innovate would be my innovation dream.
It's awesome. Snap.
So, it's interesting. I've been thinking about sort of what does our new normal look like, and what's the opportunity for the stuff that I'm really passionate about around purpose. And I work a lot with an organization called One Young World, which is a collection of, or collective of young leaders around the world who are very purpose driven. And I look at what they're doing through this crisis and they amaze me. And I think, wouldn't it be amazing if some of those people were actually the CEOs of the big companies that take us forward out of this crisis? And wouldn't this be amazing if this was the tipping point that allowed us to shift leadership from the traditional leaders to the ones that really have purpose in their DNA, and move us forward as a society, as business, as countries, as the world, with that kind of purpose of one world and social business as the sort of heart of it. So that's my dream.
Wonderful. Colin, last but not least.
Yeah, that's a lovely one from Snow. I guess this one expands it. I mean, my dream is that with innovation and the technologies that are now available, we're able to go and create a world where all the basic needs of people are covered, that we see this world of abundance where whether it's access to food or shelter or medicine, so that you can maintain your health, that those costs, internet access, those costs start to plummet or continue to plummet and eventually essentially become free. And then over time we're able to see a world where, like Snar said, that the purpose of life pivots from waking up and try to earn money to survive to actually just working out how to enjoy life, and doing the things that you really enjoy, doing, and the income requirement side of things is vastly reduced in terms of its importance to do that.
Wow. Well, my innovation dream is figuring out how I could teleport myself to South Africa again to visit you, Colin, and without having to get on an aircraft. But I will just say, thank you all so much for these pearls, and for being so candid with your thoughts around the future, what the opportunities are, and it's just, I mean, it's a wonderful thing to be able to have these kind of conversations in spaces where we're not necessarily bound by some of the things that we would have been bound by, 6 weeks ago, even, or 10, or let's say 8 weeks ago. Even the fact that we could all get our calendars to align to be able to be here. So I want to say thank you. Thank you, Dr. Houston. Thank you, Colin. Thank you, Grace. Thank you, Sneha. It has been an absolute pleasure having you. Thank you all to our participants who were so patiently waiting for us. I'm sure that it was absolutely worth the wait. Tomorrow, we will be returning for the Town Hall Summit Day 2, with being a founder during crisis at 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, 3 p.m. GMT. I have to do that in my head. That was very quick. And then we will, at 11:15 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, complete with our final plenary session, Purpose-Driven Leadership, 11:15 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, 4:15 p.m. GMT. Thank you for joining us, and thank you for coming. See you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.